Norman Finkelstein is here with us today. Norman Finkelstein is a political scientist and activist whose primary fields of research are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the politics of the Holocaust. He received his PhD in political science from Princeton University. He has held faculty positions at Brooklyn College, Rutgers University, Hunter College, New York University, and DePaul University, where he was an assistant professor from 2001 to 2007. His books include The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, and most recently, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, Politically Incorrect Thoughts on Cancel Culture and Academic Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for having me.
You know what? There's no one else I'd rather have than you today, and I'm so glad you joined us because I think there's so much confusion to what's going on in Israel, Palestine. If you talk to a lot of people out there who aren't in our political bubble, they really don't have a clue to what's going on. And if you look at our mainstream media, they seem even more lost. I haven't seen one politician or candidate out there who's really spoke up for the rights of the Palestinian people. So, I mean, I wanted you to come here today, not only to talk about solutions and where we are and what's going on, but maybe you can give us a little brief history lesson to bring us up to date to why we are where we're at today. I don't think a lot of people understand how Israel was formed, but maybe you can do that. And please, Professor Finkelstein, I know you've probably had almost every single pushback on every single subject from, well, Jews lived here for quite some time. They had a right to that land. So if you have an opposing view in your mind that you've already pushed back against, please bring in that point of view so we can really get an understanding of why we are where we are at today. Go right ahead.
Well, I want to set forth the basic facts about the situation in Gaza. It's hard to separate it out from the whole history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I don't think we have enough time to do the whole history. I want to focus for the moment on what's obviously an imminent catastrophe in Gaza, and so I want to focus on that history. Before I get to the history, I want to situate Gaza, the basic facts. Every time you hear the word Gaza, these are the facts that should leap to the forefront of your mind. Number one, 70% of the population of Gaza consists of refugees and descendants of refugees from the 1948 war, in the course of which Israel was created and about 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the state of Israel. Roughly 290,000 of those 750,000 ended up in Gaza. So the population of Gaza, which now stands at approximately 2.1 million people, 70% of that population are refugees or descendants of refugees. Fact number two, whenever you hear the word Gaza, remember, 1/2 of the population of Gaza consists of children. So whenever you hear these diabolical plans being cooked up by Israel, bear in mind the objects of those plans are 1 million or more children. Fact number three, Gaza is among the most densely populated places on God's earth. It's more densely populated than Tokyo.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Gaza, believe it or not, its dimensions are 5 miles by 25 miles. What does that mean to your average listener? Well, for me, it means that Gaza's width is the circumference of the seashore where I jog every morning. It's 5 miles. Its length is shorter than a marathon. A marathon is 26.2 miles. The whole length of Gaza is 25 miles. That's Gaza. Now, what's the situation in Gaza? It's impossible now for me to trace it back to 1948, when the conflict began, or at least the conflict climaxed in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. I'm going to fast forward to 2006. In January 2006, there were parliamentary elections in Gaza and the West Bank. And those elections were urged on Gaza by, among other parties, the United States. Jimmy Carter went to Gaza to monitor the elections. He declared that the elections were honest and fair. As a consequence of those elections, Hamas was elected, or Hamas achieved a majority of votes in the election. Immediately as Hamas came to power in completely honest and fair elections, which were urged upon the people of Gaza by the United States, immediately as Hamas won the elections, Israel imposed a brutal economic blockade on Gaza. That blockade was followed thereafter by sanctions imposed by the United States and the EU. What does that blockade mean in practice? So forgive me for repeating myself. Unless these basic facts are understood, everything that's happened in the past couple of days will be a mystery. So let's bear in mind, we're talking about 1 million children. We're talking about a population that's overwhelmingly refugees. Israel imposed this blockade on Gaza. 1/2 of the population, and this has been consistent since 2006, because I've studied the literature or the human rights reports and the humanitarian reports from 2006 to the present. We're talking about roughly 20 years, 2 decades. And if you look at that period, half the population of Gaza is unemployed. Among the youth, the figures are 60%. If I'm not mistaken, that's the highest unemployment rate of any area in the world. Number 2, nobody, barring the rarest exceptions, nobody can go into Gaza, and nobody can leave Gaza. Nobody can go in. Nobody can leave. When you look at those young men who breached the gates of Gaza this past couple of days ago, most of those people, if not all, have never seen anything in their lives except that 5-mile wide by 25-mile long strip of land. This was their first time free. Now, having said that, it's not altogether a surprise that even the UK's Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, he described Gaza as, quote, an open-air prison. Now, one of Israel's leading sociologists, he taught at the Hebrew University, he passed away early before the blockade was imposed on Gaza. That's before 2006. In a book he wrote in 2003, he described Gaza. I'm holding up the book now and I'm reading from page 169. The book is entitled Politicide, Ariel Sharon's War Against the Palestinians. And Baruch Kimmerling, who's the author, he describes Gaza as the largest concentration camp ever to exist. The largest concentration camp ever to exist. So, the bottom line is that the population of Gaza has been trapped. And in half the cases, believe it or not, they were born into a concentration camp. From their birth, to their childhood, to their youth, to their adulthood, the only thing they've experienced is a concentration camp. Currently, half the population is classified by international humanitarian organizations. It's classified as suffering from, quote, severe food insecurity. Here is the question. What were the people of Gaza supposed to do? I'm going to give you a frank, personal admission, and I'm not proud of it, but I want to place this current situation in context. I first became involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in June 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on a topic related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then I ended up devoting the whole of my adult life to that conflict. 40 years. And come 2020, even I gave up. I started to write about other subjects. I thought the situation was hopeless. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of guilt stirred up inside me because I realized I was abandoning a people trapped in a concentration camp. Now, I don't want to be emotive. I don't want to be dramatic. However, it behooves me to say both my parents were in concentration camps during World War II. My mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. My father was in Auschwitz concentration camp. And I was riddled with guilt that people facing circumstances like my parents, and I had abandoned them. So, if even I had abandoned them, not making any claims to sainthood, but simply the fact that I invested 40 years of my life in that conflict and finally had to resign myself to the fact that nothing could be done. So, Does it really surprise you? Is it really a shock that a couple of days ago, the people of Gaza, most of whom, let's bear it in mind, most of whom were born in that concentration camp. Mm-hmm. They were born into it. Does it really shock you that they would do something desperate to break free of that concentration camp? Mm. And who dare criticize whatever tactics they employed? I am not approving it, but I am not disapproving it, because I don't know what I would do if I had been born into a concentration camp and spent 20 years of my life there.
Yeah. I've seen you in videos talk about what a lot of these IDF soldiers have done to these children, these kids, and taking out eyes and limbs and whatnot. But I want to stay with Hamas for a second, because I think this is important. Because there's a lot of people right now, especially when it comes to our government, you know, our lawmakers, they immediately go to Hamas. They single out Hamas and they say Hamas is a bunch of terrorists, they're awful, and that somehow manufactures consent for the United States to supply Israel with as much weaponry as as we can, and then for them to go after and with no compassion whatsoever bomb buildings and schools and hospitals. I mean, I don't think we see a month go by without a Palestinian baby getting killed or shelled or shot. But I want to talk a little bit more about Hamas, because there's a little bit more nuance to the situation. Now, first question I have is, from what I said before you came on, right when we were introducing you, a lot of people are kind of framing this as Israel versus Hamas. I think Hamas was just one small faction of this, or maybe a big faction of this, but I would say this is Israel versus Palestine, that there are other groups that have joined with Hamas and whatnot because their backs are so against the wall that they have nothing to lose at this point. And I also said that this was inevitable, that this was bound to happen. I mean, it had to happen because, you know, like I said, their backs are completely against the wall. There's been a blockade going on there for quite some time. Israel has not stopped expanding their settlements. So for me, this was inevitable that it was going to happen. So the first question is, number one, is it right to say it's just versus Hamas, or is it more of a bigger resistant coalition going on in Gaza and Palestine? And number two, we have this video here from Ron Paul. When Ron Paul mentioned on the floor of Congress that Hamas was actually started by Israel. I'm going to play this really quickly, and then we'll get your answers.
What's happening in the Middle East, and in particular with Gaza right now, we have some moral responsibility for both sides in a way, because we provide help and funding for both Arab nations and Israel. And so we definitely have a moral responsibility, and especially now today, the weapons being used to kill so many Palestinians are American weapons, and American funds essentially are being used for this. But there's a political liability, which I think is something that we fail to look at, because too often there's so much blowback from our intervention in areas that we shouldn't be involved in. You know, Hamas, if you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage Palestinians to have a free election. They do elect Hamas. So we first indirectly and directly through Israel help establish Hamas. Then we have election. Then Hamas is dominant, so we have to kill them. So it just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, you know, we were allied with Osama bin Laden, and we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA was good.
All right, we'll leave it at there, Professor Finkelstein. But the two questions: number one, is this a war that now Israel has declared is directly against Hamas only? And second, is it true also that Israel started Hamas as to push back against the PLO and Yasser Arafat? Can you give us a little insight to these statements over here?
It is factually correct what Ron Paul said, that Israel encouraged in various ways, for example, by not exerting as much repression on Hamas as it did on the PLO back in those years, in order to create a counterweight to the PLO. I don't want to get involved in that history because to some extent, even though the point he made is historically valid, it's, if you don't mind my saying so, it's water under the bridge.
No.
It's happened. So we're going to just accept it as a fact, though as a historical point, he is correct. Let's talk about several things about Hamas. Bear in mind, as I continue, I do not defend Hamas. That's the responsibility of the Palestinian people to choose their leaders. If that economic blockade had not been imposed and Hamas failed in its leadership responsibilities, presumably it would have been voted out, Hamas would have been voted out in the next election. The democratic process was never allowed to the Palestinian people. Hillary Clinton, who was a senator at the time, when the elections occurred in Gaza, this was her response. I'm quoting her. "We should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win." That's the American notion of democratic elections. We should rig them so the people will choose only the candidates that we want. Now, having said that, it is true, because we do not in any way want to distort the historical record. The truth is on the side of the Palestinian people, and the truth is on the side of the people of Gaza. It is true that up until the election of 2006, Hamas didn't recognize Israel as a state. However, once it came into power, it was undergoing an evolution which quite possibly, I'm not going to say certainly, it would quite possibly would have resulted in a leadership willing to negotiate with Israel. They were never given the chance. Now, you say, is it Hamas or is it the people of Gaza? I am not going to say they are one and the same. However, I will say that who fertilizes Hamas? Who foments the support for Hamas? Who are the young people who join Hamas? If they were given an opportunity in life, if they were given a chance, if they were able to breathe, I don't know if they would have joined Hamas. Most of these young people are at the point where they're willing to just sacrifice their life because the situation is so hopeless. So I can't separate Hamas from the people of Gaza because the blockade creates, the blockade creates a synthesis and assimilation between the people and Hamas. They have no other options. They have no other choices. And this is the question. This is the question that we must constantly ask ourselves. What were their options? Allow me, since you wanted me to fill in for your audience, to look at the history. Now, periodically, Israel launches these brutal, merciless, criminal assaults on Gaza. There are so many of them that literally I can't remember all the names, but at least two might be familiar to your listeners. In 2007, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. It went from December 26, 2008 to January 17th, 2009. Amnesty International published a report on that, a large report on that assault. They called the report 22 Days of Death and Destruction. Israel killed about 1,400 people, including 350 children. It demolished, it flattened 6,000 homes. Then I'm going to skip the 3 or 4 other assaults and go to 2014. Israel launches Operation Protective Edge. It kills 550 Palestinian children. It demolishes 18,000 homes. Peter Maurer, he was the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. He went to visit Gaza after those 51 days of death and destruction. And now I'm going to quote him. I hope your audience will bear in mind. We're talking about the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which means he's seen many war zones. Indeed, his job is to visit war zones. And this is what he had to say after Israel's Operation Protective Edge. Quote, I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. And who is this destruction being visited upon? This unprecedented destruction, who is it being visited on? It's being visited on a population that's overwhelmingly refugees and which is half children. That's who the heroic IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, inflicts the most massive destruction that the president of the ICRC ever witnessed in his professional career. Yeah. Now, you might say, justifiably, you can talk about options. Well, why haven't the Palestinians tried nonviolence? Why haven't the people of Gaza tried nonviolence? But they did. In 2018, they launched the Great March of Return. And at the beginning, it was wholly nonviolent. What did Israel do? Well, there is a very good human rights report that was issued by the UN describing what Israel did. Does the audience want to know? I'll tell them. According to the report, Israel targeted medical personnel, targeted. It targeted journalists. It targeted people with physical disabilities. What were the snipers targeting? They were targeting kneecaps and below. So, does it shock anyone? Is it really so bewildering that after attempting a nonviolent resistance, medical personnel were targeted, journalists were targeted, people with disabilities were targeted? Is it really a shock that it deteriorated and ultimately failed in its goals, in its objectives, to end that brutal, inhuman blockade of Gaza? So, let's go back to the basic question. What were they supposed to do? Benjamin Netanyahu, he announced that he was going to compress, reduce the Palestine question by negotiating all of these agreements with neighboring Arab countries, and then the Palestine question would vanish. What does vanish mean? What does vanish mean? It means the Gaza ghetto, the Gaza concentration camp, will just continue along its way, and the people left there to die. That's the goal, to leave the people there to die.
Yeah.
Well, the people refused to die. And now Israel has finally announced, and it's not me, because I know there are some people on Twitter and some people in this social media who are rushing to silence anyone who makes comparisons between Israeli conduct and Nazis. So, as we proceed, I hope the social media police will bear in mind it's not me, it's Israel's defense minister who has just announced that they will not allow any electricity. They will not allow any water. They will not allow any food. They will not allow any fuel into Gaza.
Yeah.
Now, bear in mind, Benjamin Netanyahu announced yesterday that Israelis should be prepared for a long war. If you put those two statements together, now I ask the social media police to bear in mind, it's not me. I am simply quoting from the Israeli leadership. If you put those two statements together, what it means is there will be no food, no water, no electricity, and no fuel allowed in Gaza for a long time.
Yeah.
So, what do we conclude from that? I conclude that the Israeli government has finally figured out the final solution to the Gaza problem. That's what I conclude, I infer from the information that's being broadcast by this government.
Yeah. Complete and total genocide.
And endorsed not only by President Biden, not only today endorsed by former President Barack Obama, endorsed by the whole squad, so-called, except for Cori Bush, or the squad members who have issued statements so far, except for Cori Bush. And it has to be said, that Bernie Sanders has gone along with it.
Yeah.
Now, during his campaign, Bernie Sanders did say the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted. He did say it, and I want to acknowledge it. But right now, he is a moral disgrace. He disgraces himself, and I don't say this with any glee. I say it with disgust.
Yeah, yeah.
He's often said, he doesn't flaunt it, but when asked, he said that a large part of his family was wiped out in Poland during World War II. A large part of his family was wiped out in Poland during World War II. And yet, not only has he not criticized President Biden's sending of arms promiscuously to Ukraine, in which they land in the hands of Nazis tracing their descendancy back to World War II, but now he's lent his name to the genocidal assault on the people of Gaza. It is a disgrace. It fills me with such disgust at how cowardly he is or has become.
I got to tell. Go ahead, Doc. Go ahead, Professor. I have his comment up here. I just wanted to show you really quickly. I absolutely condemn the horrifying attack on Israel by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. There is no justification for this violence, and innocent people on both sides will suffer hugely because of it. It must end now. So that was his, yeah.
No justification. No justification. People immured, interned in a concentration camp for 20 years.
Yeah.
And they're trying to break out. There's no justification for what's happening. No.
Yeah. At least Professor Finkelstein, he didn't say unprovoked, though. He didn't say unprovoked like everybody else. Unprovoked. I'm like, are we to pretend that there's no blockade going on in Gaza? Are we to pretend that Gaza citizens, Palestinians, aren't murdered on a regular basis in Gaza? It's mind-blowing. Please continue.
The only exceptions, because they're honorable exceptions, the only exceptions I am aware of are, first of all, Dr. Cornel West, who issued a statement yesterday, which I found perfectly reasonable. And there are a couple of Israelis, Gideon Levy, for those of you who have an opportunity to read his statement today, and a real person of the left, Claire Daly.
Oh, yeah.
She issued a statement yesterday, and it warms you, even in the midst of all of this torment and anguish. It just warms you in its humanity. She said, Ursula von der Leyen, preacher in the EU, she said, we all stand behind Israel. And Claire Daly said, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You're not an elected official. We haven't taken a stand on it. And then she said, quote, speaking directly to Ursula von der Leyen, if you have nothing constructive to say, just shut up. And that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel with Bernie. And that's how I feel with AOC. And that's how I feel with Ilhan Omar. You have nothing constructive to say. You just say what will buy you brownie points. Then just shut up.
Yeah. Now, last week I praised Representative Matt Gaetz for what he did in the House. It's something I wanted the squad to do. And I thought it was awesome because there were a lot of things that I really wanted that he was pushing for. Single item spending bills, which is really important. The stopping of aiding and funds to Ukraine, really important. Some of the other things I weren't crazy about, but I did praise him for it. Now, he says this the other day, I'm closely monitoring the terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel today. Hamas has no goals for prosperity. They only bring ruin and terror. Israel has every right to defend itself. We are praying for peace and safety for everyone in Israel today. I guess the Palestinians don't get any of that peace.
Well, you know, I promise you, a vast majority of people do not think of Gaza as the prison that it is. Like, they don't think of it that way.
I know they don't know.
It sounds like North Korea when they say about North Korea, how bad those concentration camps are.
Yeah,
and 3 generations of a family have to be born there.
Yeah,
except with a lot more space and less people in it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are movies like Gaza Fights for Freedom and other movies that have broken through that have shown what goes on in Gaza. But I mean, Israel, the Israeli lobby has a very strong control on our media. They don't let a lot of this information out. And like Professor Finkelstein said, if people would just understand and know the truth.
Well, let's say it's not even a prison. It's just a really bad ghetto. I mean, at best, you could say, I guess, if you want to be dishonest about it. Has that system worked? Why did this happen if that was the right way to handle it?
Yeah. This is something Marjorie Taylor Greene said. We stand with our great friend and ally, Israel, as they declare war against Islamic terrorists. Over 1,000 Iran-backed Hamas terrorists invaded Israel, slaughtering Israeli citizens right at the end of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. Make no mistake, this is Islam's holy war, and their ultimate goal is to wipe out all of Israel. America will not allow it. How much of the $6 billion Joe Biden gave back to the Iran-funded this attack against Israel? President Trump would have never given that money to Iran. May God protect Israel. Now, the reason why I brought this up is because...
She just mentioned it's probably Ukraine and Afghanistan weapons. What are they...
Well, here's the thing.
Weapons?
We've heard Marjorie Taylor Greene, we've heard Matt Gaetz talk about why are we funding Ukraine? They're not the 51st state. Well, my question to you, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, is Israel the 51st state? Because we give them $3 billion in aid. And Professor Finkelstein, this is very scary right here. And I brought this up because these two particular lawmakers are considered part of the populist right? The Trump movement, the MAGA movement, whatever you want to call it. They're a little bit different than the rhinos and the establishment, Nikki Haley's and Lindsey Graham, which we'll get to them in a second. But this talk that Iran, that Iran is backing this with no proof whatsoever. In fact, I believe the Iran statement was that they had no idea what was going on. They're not involved with Palestinian affairs. Yes, they stand in solidarity with the oppressed people of in Gaza and the Palestinians, but they weren't part of this planning. This right here scares me, Professor Finkelstein, because it seems like it could spin out of control into World War III. A lot of people don't know their history, and they simply just go behind this whole, oh, it's Hamas, they're terrorists. Now, I was going to ask you if they are terrorists, if they are a terrorist organization, or are they freedom fighters? But the nuance you provided, I think, says a lot. What would you say to Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene if they use this excuse that Israel has a right to do what they have to do because they're wiping out terrorists? Because I don't understand when they start speaking this language. What's the difference between a terrorist and a murderer? Israel murders a lot more citizens, a lot more Palestinians than Palestinians murder Israelis. Please go right ahead.
First of all, we have to bear in mind that even if what you're saying is true, not you, I'm speaking now to Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Let's say everything you say is true, okay? Now, Israel has announced that in order to cure this problem, to correct this problem, they are going to commit a genocide against the people of Gaza. That's the announcement, not by trivial figures, not by marginal figures, by the defense minister and the prime minister. Israel has embarked on a genocide in Gaza. So I would ask Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene a very simple question. Do you support starving to death 1 million Gaza children? Do you support that? That's Israel's, it's not a secret plan. We don't have to infer the plan. We don't have to connect any dots because there are spaces in the reasoning. It's right out there. So I ask Matt Getz, I ask Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I ask all the other people who you're going to bring to my attention now or cite for me. Do you support? Because you're giving blanket support to Israel. That's what you're doing. You're giving blanket support to Israel. Barack Obama said today, we support Israel in dismantling Hamas. That's what he said. Now, Israel has announced, Mr. Barack Obama, Nobel Peace Prize winner, Israel has announced exactly how it's going to go about dismantling Hamas. How is it going to go about it? What is it going to do? It's going to deny the people of Gaza any food, water, fuel, or electricity. That's what they're going to do. So I want to know, Mr. Obama, do you support the extermination of the Palestinian people in Gaza? Because that's what it means in practice. When you give blanket support to Israel, you are giving blanket support to the extermination of the Palestinian people. So you have to accept responsibility for your words. Secondly, if you end the blockade of Gaza, which you have to under international law, because under international law, the blockade constitutes a form of collective punishment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's illegal under international law. If you end the blockade of Gaza, from my point of view, there's no reason to suppose that the people of Gaza are like every other person on God's earth, and that they will seek out all sorts of opportunities to improve their lives. Now, you might say, oh, that sounds so rosy, and we're talking about Islamic terrorists. Yeah, I could be wrong. But then the people of Gaza will have the opportunity, as they did in 2006. They voted out the Palestinian Authority, and they voted in Hamas. And there was no reason to suppose that if they had been allowed to carry on democratic elections in an ordinary life, that they simply would have said, we don't want Hamas anymore because they're messing things up for us. They weren't given the chance. The day after the results of the election, Israel immediately imposed, and then the EU and the US went along with, the brutal blockade on Gaza. They were never given the chance. So I would say the main concern now, because you spoke to me earlier, not that I'm trying to end it, but I want to, convey something practical to your audience or our audience. That is, the main goal has to be to end that illegal, that criminal, that immoral, that godforsaken blockade of Gaza, and let the people live finally. Let them breathe finally.
Yeah.
And then we see what happens.
I would hope that something like that could happen, and I think that's a great suggestion. But we have politicians, Professor Finkelstein, like this. Nikki Haley, listen to what she has to say.
But let's step back, because I want the American people to kind of take this in for a second. Just imagine that here the Israelis woke up and communities were bombarded, families were murdered, women and children were taken hostage, dragged through the streets, the elderly were taken. All of this has happened in front of everyone, on top of thousands of rockets that hit Israel. This should be personal for every woman and man in America. Why? Because when they did this surprise attack, when they took these hostages, when they murdered these families, they were celebrating. And what were they celebrating? They were saying death to Israel, death to America. This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America because they hate us just as much. And what we have to understand is this is the reason that we have to unite around making sure our enemies do not hurt our friends. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this. You know Iran's behind it. Finish them. They should have hell to pay for what they've just done.
So, Professor Finkelstein, that is not the only person, because we have this gentleman over here, Lindsey Graham, another person who is not only saying, you know, this is about terrorists coming in and, you know, the same lines again from Nikki Haley. Their freedom is tied to our freedom. This is not an attack on Israel. This is an attack on us. But then we have other establishment Republicans that are drawing lines in the sands when it comes to geopolitical matters, talking about, well, we're going to make sure that we hold Saudi Arabia to account. They can't just say whatever. They have to condemn Hamas. Even Blinken was waving his finger at the Chinese as if he was going to get them to go along with it. But listen to what Lindsey Graham has to say, and then I would like your opinions, because this, once again, this type of rhetoric and this manufacturing of consent, especially from a controlled media, when a lot of our information has not been able to get out, has not been able to been, you know, publicized. I mean, I know there's shadow bans on anybody who speaks out against the state of Israel. That's been like that for quite some time. I think the first people to ever get censored on the intranet were people who were speaking on behalf of the Palestinians and against Israel. But listen to this real quickly and then give me your statement, because how do we push back against this rhetoric when you say, let's lift the blockade? We have guys like this saying we can't do that because then they're going to just commit more murder. Listen.
So I've been on the phone all day to the Mideast, and I've told our allies and people with connections to Iran, what I would do, I would tell Iran that if Hezbollah attacks Israel, we're going to come after you, the Iranians, and have a coordinated effort between the United States and Israel to put Iran out of the oil business by destroying their refineries. There are 4 major refineries in Iran. They're fixed targets. If Hezbollah attacks Israel, I would make Iran pay a heavy price.
I don't know if you've heard, Professor Finkelstein, of the USS Liberty, but it almost seemed like that particular attack when Israel fired upon an American vessel, killing 30-something odd sailors, and then turning around and say, oops, it was a mistake. I don't think it was any mistake whatsoever. I think they wanted to sink that vessel and draw America into war. The same way that Lindsey Graham seems to be trying to draw, along with Israel, they seem to be wanting to draw America into war against Iran. But we know with Russia's relationship with Iran, all hell could break loose, and the next thing you know, it's World War III. Please, your opinions.
Well, first of all, the Tulsi Gabbard. I want to get to the question you just mentioned. It's very important. But first, Tulsi Gabbard.
Should we put up her statement for you real quick?
You just read it. You just heard her, so it's fine.
Gotcha.
So, first of all, what Israel witnessed on that morning, Palestinians witnessed many times.
That was Nikki Haley, by the way, we played.
Excuse me, Nikki Haley. Excuse me. I don't have the, I'm not wearing my glasses.
My bad, my bad.
Nikki Haley. So, the Palestinians have witnessed that many times what Israel witnessed on the morning a couple of days ago. Each of those operations, what was the result? we have huge numbers of human rights reports. Each time Israel entered Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Protective Edge, and many operations in between, they targeted homes. They targeted hospitals. They targeted mosques. They targeted children. That's all voluminously documented. I'm talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of human rights reports, which I've read. Thousands of pages documenting attacking children, targeting mosques, targeting schools, targeting ambulances, targeting hospitals. 350 children killed in one operation, 550 children killed in another operation. So, Nikki Haley, if you're so concerned about what Israel experienced on that morning, where is the concern for the fact that the people in this concentration camp have constantly, repeatedly had to bear witness to the same magnitude of atrocities? Well, actually much smaller. The Israeli atrocities were much smaller. The atrocities committed against Israel were, as of now, much smaller than what happened in Gaza. The second thing is, it's a simple question for me. It's called responsibility of your words. She said, finish them off. That's her words.
Scary.
Finish off. Now, who is the them? She says it's Hamas. Okay. Israel has said, announced how it's going to finish off Hamas. It's announced its plan. The war plan is out there. It's going to deny the 2.1 million people of Gaza any water, fuel, food for a long time. So Nikki Haley is advocating, in effect, the extermination of the people of Gaza. As to Lindsey Graham, there seems to be, I think, a lack of, there's such an arrogance and bravado, and so completely lacking any sense of how quickly, if any normal person acted on the statements that Lindsey Graham is making.
Yeah.
What will happen? I think that there's not even, I don't know, the whole thing would just spiral out of control. Do you know why Israel has not attacked Hezbollah in Lebanon? It wants to. You know why it is not?
Because it got its butt kicked in 1982?
Oh, it had its butt kicked in 2006.
Yeah, more recent.
2006 too, right? Yeah.
However, that's not the only reason. It's reported that Hezbollah has amassed, now I don't know if the numbers are right. I'm just telling you, reported. They've amassed something on the order of 100,000 missiles. And those missiles, the head of Hezbollah, Sayed Nasrallah, has said they can and they will reach Tel Aviv. And there are certain targets in Tel Aviv, if they are hit, and Sayed Nasrallah has already mentioned them by name, if they are hit, you're going to have a catastrophe on a scale that's completely unimaginable. So when this imbecile starts making statements like that, anybody who cares about humanity, including Israeli humanity, anyone who has a jot of feeling for any humanity would tell Mr. Lindsey Graham what Claire Daly told Ursula von der Leyen, and I'll quote her: "If you have nothing constructive to say, shut up."